thank you for having me here today. This is a series that I've been doing on my YouTube channel. It's called Beholding Eternity. One of the reasons why I called it Beholding Eternity because it contains the path, what we call the prophetic path. Oh, and one disclaimer: if you can't hear me in the back, I am soft-spoken. So if you can't hear me, like do something like this, so I can make sure that I raise my voice, because I get used to just talking to people in small groups. But the idea of beholding eternity is we want to be able to walk back into the presence of God. And in the ancient world, there was a prophetic path. And this prophetic path was taught in what we would call nowadays as schools of the prophets. Sometimes they're called mystery schools. So in many ways, the Book of Mormon as a sealed book or an encrypted book contains many of these mysteries meant for us today. In other words, somebody somewhere knew that many of these things were going to be lost, or that they were not going to be had by any one group of people. So they put together a record of this knowledge, the purpose of which was to change us from the inside out and to give us the tools that we need to establish a New Jerusalem. Not just a physical city, but a New Jerusalem here. Okay? So because everything in the Hebraic world is not as much outside in as much as is inside out. We start within and we manifest it on the outside. Whereas most of our culture, if you'll notice, is change it on the outside and the inside will follow. Well, not always. So we're gonna explore a little bit of the tree of life. The picture you'll see here is one diagram. There are many types of diagrams that have been presented through over the years for the tree of life. The tree of life is actually conceptual. In other words, there are certain sects of Jews who do not hold to this diagram. They have the same concepts, but they don't frame it in an image because they believe, some of them believe, that it is a violation of thou shalt not make an image or graven image of God. But all it is a conceptual tool to help us to understand. So when you see the diagram, note that it's not like etched in, well, it might be etched in stone somewhere, but it's like it's a little more fluid, and people have their own approaches to it. So like, for example, you will see a Hermetic tree of life out of Egypt. Very similar, but if you were to research it, you'll notice there are some subtle differences. There is a Christian Kabbalistic tree of life. It's again similar, but some differences. Okay, there is an Islamic tree of life that is very similar, but again has its own differences. And the idea being is that what we want is, each of these traditions, each of these groups of people obviously preserved the understanding that there was a tree of life, but each of them had their own cultural and their own religious approaches of how they were to understand the tree. Well, we're going to try to understand it from the Book of Mormon's perspective. Okay? And in doing that, but at least we need to have a foundation of what it gives you, a framework and a picture of what we're going to be discussing. So you'll notice on each side here, on the right side there, you will notice that you have a two-pillared tree of life. Now, the two pillars there are masculine and a feminine. The masculine on the right side, the feminine on the left. The masculine represents things like strength, order, structure. The feminine, wisdom, mercy, but can also go to chaos. So in other words, each side has its polar extremes. Too much masculine, and you get a hyper-structured society, hyper-patriarchalism, hyper structure and order, very force-based. Too much feminine, chaos, no structure, no order, absolute anarchy if it goes to the extreme. So what happens is we bring the two together in a balance. And that balance is what we call the center pillar. It's also called the way. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Well, that way is the balancing of the two. And that's the goal. Yes, ma'am.
So when you said that, it immediately came to how they were trying to feminize men, you know, and it does create chaos.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now say that again.
So they're trying to make men more feminine, or you know, this transgender and stuff like that. And when the men are acting more feminine, he's saying that the feminine can sometimes be chaos.
Yeah. So what we want to find is the balance between the two. In other words, going too far in any extreme always causes problems. I mean, take a look, for example. Imagine like Germany during Hitler's regime. Hyperstructure, hyper-patriarchal, hyper-order. Right? Too dominant on the male pillar. Okay, and no joke. Now imagine, say, I would equate to like 60 Summers of Love. Everything's love and hugs. Where, oh, we just love and everything is okay and everything is just free love and it doesn't matter and everybody has his own truth. But the reality is, and society swings on a pendulum. To the degree it goes one, it'll go back to the other until the rhythm gets so strong that society tears itself apart. It can no longer balance itself. So the goal, whether it be in our societies or our homes or even in ourselves, is to find the balance between the masculine and the feminine. And that's why our approach to the Tree of Life should always be the idea of what brings about oneness. What brings about balance? Because again, when you say feminine, what I do not want you to take away is that I'm addressing, that I'm commenting on women in general. I'm talking about feminine characteristics, or characteristics that have been defined as feminine, culturally and traditionally. It doesn't mean this is a commentary on you as women. It's just an attribute. Okay? The same thing with men. Okay, just because the hypermasculine is that way does not mean all men are that way. You know, you're going to see everybody on that spectrum in between. And the goal is to try to find the point of balance that is called the way. And then once we get to that point of balance, then we walk in that way. That's where we find the balancing between justice and mercy. We find the balance between glory and long-suffering. And all of these attributes of God to create a state of beauty, tiferet. Okay? And tiferet, beauty, is that state that is represented by the heart of the tree there, number 6 in the yellow there. It's the heart of the tree. That's called the secret of Messiah. It is also called the secret of the Son. He creates the point or the epicenter of perfect balance. It's actually represented by a Star of David. You know, sometimes a three-dimensional Star of David, a Merkabah, but it's the idea of you're creating a vessel. So there's two competing traditions in Judaism that bear sway on these particular Tree of Life doctrines. One is, of course, Kabbalistic traditions that came out. Kabbalism really came out, I think it was the preserved remnants of what was left of the mystery schools in Israel, and came about, I believe, somewhere between the 9th and the 13th century. But the older tradition, which the Book of Mormon seems to follow, but shares many of the same concepts, is that of what we call the Ma'aseh Merkavah, the workings of the chariot or the vessel. And if you'll notice throughout the Book of Mormon, how many times we reference the idea of a vessel. Nephi's boat, the brother of Jared's barges. These are vessel imagery, and these chapters where it mentions these things are meant to draw our attention to these ancient teachings of the Ma'aseh Merkavah, or the workings of the vessel. Yes.
In the temple, a lot of times they will say that the altar or what held, the manna and the rod of Aaron or whatever, that was a chariot throne.
Yeah, that's what we call it teba. It's a vessel. It's a vessel, a teba, and
but why the chariot? Because you always have Christ going up and back in the chariot.
So Ezekiel's visions, Elijah going up in a chariot. That's where that's why they call it the workings of the chariot. How did Elijah ascend into heaven? A chariot came, but the actual word is Merkavah. But what was it? Well, that's why you get all the speculation. Well, it was an alien craft, or it was. Some people will give you all these different things, but either way, we know it was a vessel of some type. The question is, what kind? Was it an actual physical vessel? Maybe, but was it a spiritual vessel as first? Definitely.
Well, on the top, right, on the top of it were the two seraphim reaching out towards each other, traditionally one male, one female. The concept of the hieroscomos, the holiest connection between a man and a woman.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
That's an interesting
The blending
thought.
of the male and female.
Yeah.
And then it the point of balance.
to the heavens.
Exactly. So you have that blending of the male and female. In other words, the bringing together of the two pillars. We find the point of balance, and that releases or opens up a conduit. Okay? And that conduit connects us to heaven. When a state of oneness is achieved between whether it be male and female, or God and us, or however we want to describe it, then it opens up a door or a portal or doorway, if you will, spiritual doorway, that connects heaven and earth, that connects you to heaven.
So it also has the Ark of the Covenant, right? That's what it was, the Ark. And we think of Noah's Ark. And Noah.
And Moses' ark.
So we're talking, we might not see the feminine, but there's something with the female oneness.
Yes.
That
it doesn't happen without it.
Language.
Exactly.
It just isn't, you don't see it.
That's because the reason, and I want to dispel something here about the feminine. It is not hidden because it is lesser. It is hidden because of its radiance and its beauty. When I say one of the reasons, that's why the idea of a veil. Okay, remember when Moses came down from the mountain and his countenance was so brilliant, his radiance was so brilliant, he had to veil his face? Okay, that's the concept that you as women, when you veil your faces, represent. You represent a person who's in a state of oneness, and you represent that radiance that is being both protected and shielded both ways behind that veil. It's not meant to be less than. It's actually a symbol of exaltation. It's the idea of, we're practicing in symbol form in our temples. What in the spiritual form is the deep and very intimate spiritual oneness that exists between the male and the female, and what the female represents. So if anybody comes across as if it's a lesser thing, they're really functioning in the world of the natural man. In the world of the natural man, man is up here, female is down here, and I guarantee you that will never change. Biologically, you could probably all kick my butt easily, but biologically, in the natural expression of things, men are generally have more muscle mass, we're built differently, different by design. But notice it's functional in this world. It's meant to function as well. It doesn't mean one's superior. It means we're different by design. But we are different. But we were different because we were created that way, and that exists in this natural world. But the world we are talking about, the upper worlds, that's a very different thing. And so what we want to do is to connect that upper world to this world. We want to replicate through conscious choice that which is above here. So as long as there's the natural man on the earth, you're always going to see that division and subjugation of the male, the male to the female. But if you considered a conscious choice of embracing the upper world, then it becomes a totally different environment where male and female aren't like competing, they're functioning in a state of working, or at least working toward functioning in a state of balance and oneness. Yes, ma'am.
Can you speak to that a little bit about, you spoke to it as female, but as an energy of feminine and masculine within yourself as a man, How does that look?
Well, as guys I usually find it hard. I can only cry once a day, and I can usually only experience one major emotion about once a day, and that's about it. I'm spent. I think, and this is my opinion on this, as I've studied the scriptures regarding the masculine and feminine in an individual, each of us carry those two pillars in ourselves. It's not that one is necessarily better than the other. It's that perhaps one is more dominant than the other in that person. And so the idea is we want to reach a point of balance in ourselves. And how is that done? Well, I know it sounds funny, but our 10 Sephirot here that we see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, all the way down the bottom, If you merge them into the center pillar of oneness, they're not 10 anymore, they're 7. And they mirror what we often call the chakra system out of the Middle East. We separate this way because we see that humanity is out of balance and what it needs to be brought in balance. So within ourselves, we have to have an approach. We have to have a mechanism or a way to balance those two energies. If we balance the two energies rather than fighting with one another, they begin to blend. And that blending begins to rise within yourself. It rises from the lower world, this physical body here, to a part of ourselves, according to Israelite teaching, that's still connected above. And so what we're doing is, as we reach that more and more that state of oneness, our connection with that part of ourselves that is still in heaven becomes more and more open, like a veil that disappears or opens up. And that's the concept behind it. That's why I say, when we talk about prophets and we see the structure of the church, understand that has a necessary function. A lot of people are like, I've had people say, oh, we don't need the church in this, we don't need the church in that. I'm like, no. You do need that in this world. It functions in this world. It's patterned after a heavenly pattern, But at the same time, there's a part of you that only you have the keys to. No prophet, no matter how much authority he has or how many ordinances he can give, can change your heart. The human heart is the gateway, is the doorway to heaven. We have the key to it, now we just have to learn to unlock it, because there's somebody waiting on the other side that if we unlock it and open up, then he comes in. And we begin to change from an inside out. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Is our approach to the tree of life is that inside-out approach. Now, there is an outside-in approach. Now, understand the outside-in is just as important, because when we talk about replicating the tree of life here on earth, we are talking about, if you'll notice ancient patterns, there are ancient patterns of the tree of life here on earth. Most people understand is that also the cosmos above is considered a tree of life. So many of your constellations are portions or part of that tree of life. This is why in many ancient cultures you'll see like the pyramids being laid out according to, say, Orion, the constellation Orion. Some of them will be according to Draco. Some of them will be according to Virgo and others. And so why? Because they're patting themselves here off that which is in heaven. So you do have an outside-in approach. So there is a place for that. But today we're going to talk about the inside-out approach, because in all honesty, if you think about it, the inside-out approach is more of the feminine aspect, whereas the outside-in approach is more of your masculine. Think structure, form, that kind of thing. Whereas the inside approach, the feminine energy, is the transformative energy inside. But we need both. If we have just the feminine without the masculine, it never materializes in this world. It's like if you have a community of people, but you never build a ward house, what do? It's going to be chaotic. I guess you can meet in somebody's lawn, but when you build that house, that house is the physical representation of your relationship with that greater family. It's a outer symbol of oneness. Temples are too, And so when we look at these things, we want to approach it from that standpoint. But today we're going to focus specifically on the feminine aspect and the inside-out approach, because, from my opinion, you have to embrace the feminine before the masculine gets its head together. I really do. So you'll notice here on the tree of life, from the very top to the bottom. Now, from the very top, number 1 is Keter. That represents those things pertaining to the throne of God. Okay? As you proceed down to the number 2, Chokmah, is wisdom. Notice it's on the feminine pillar there. Then it proceeds to Bina, which is understanding. Understanding is a masculine principle, but it doesn't mean that, like I said, this isn't a commentary on men and women. It's the principle of masculine and feminine. So what is Chokmah? Chokmah as wisdom is pure, just Imagine pure revelation with no structure, pure knowledge and information, unfettered. But what Bina does, understanding, is it then begins to take that knowledge and begins to organize it. It begins to put it in form and to enable it to function in this real world. So the female, and then brings forth, and then the guy or the masculine force begins to provide its functionality. Then in the center portion there, number 3, is what we call da'at, the place of knowledge. Now I'm going from the top to the bottom right now. Now normally when you progress, you go from the bottom to the top. I'm just right now want to demonstrate the tree. So we have da'at, which is knowledge. That is a point of experience. And if you were to look at this as like a cross, imagine that the head of the Savior is in that place of da'at. His body out like this, and his head resting in the very center of knowing and experiencing. Okay? Then we go from there to Hesed. Hesed is mercy. Now, mercy doesn't necessarily mean anything goes, like we think in our society. Oh, I'm being merciful. Mercy is a feminine aspect of compassion, of loving kindness kind of thing, but it's an aspect that is able to balance the masculine side. And so then we go from mercy to Gevura, which is judgment, harsh judgment. You balance the two and you bring about righteous judgment. Okay? In the center of the tree, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's right. Oh, it's just 6
in the middle.
Sorry. Yeah, you're right. 6. Picked the wrong one. 6. That is Tiferet. That is beauty. That's the heart of the tree. Symbolized by the sun. Symbolized by your heart. Okay, and it's the place of where all these attributes are in balance. Okay, and then of course we go to 7, Netzach, long suffering. Okay, 8, Hod, glory. Okay, 9. I almost have to look myself. Oh my gosh, Yesod, yes.
It's in the middle.
Yesod, which means Yesod is the foundation. It's actually, strangely enough, Yesod is both masculine and feminine. It is where the masculine and feminine must first come together. So it's a balancing. It's represented by the sexual act of the union of the male and the female. And then, of course, 10, Malkut, the world in which we live. Okay? Now, if I'm ascending back in the presence of God, where are we? Where am I at on the tree right now? We're at the very bottom. We're at the bottom rung. Like Joseph said, to ascend to heaven, you must go up a ladder, and everybody has to start at the bottom, and you ascend rung by rung. It's the same concept. So we're going to ascend this ladder. And the path of ascension is sometimes referred to by several terms. The lightning strike of heaven, the winding staircase, the winding path, whereas the center pillar is the straight and narrow way. Yes?
Could you say, though, that we needed to come to this earth in order to go down into Malkut as like roots in a tree to gather up that energy of experience and then reascend? Because as little children, we kind of bounce down and experience these things. We're innocent from the top, and then we go down through, justice, mercy, our parents, and all this experience. But then we kind of, in order to reascend, we get to kind of recreate everything.
I totally agree with that. I think this is honestly, I know a lot of people don't like it when I mention this phrase because a lot of Christians flip out because it's something they've never heard of before. But I really do believe what you're describing, and what would most fit would be what we call the Adam Kadmon, the primordial Adam, who had a body of light. Well, as the children of Adam, like a body of people, we represent his body. And when there was a fall, that vessel, that body of Adam, shattered into all of us. And we are now where? In a fallen world. Now, our goal is to reassemble the body, resurrect the body, reassemble the vessel. And this is, all honesty, where I think, in my opinion, where Brigham Young was probably just beginning to start to introduce that, with that concept of Adam God. I do believe the concept became twisted over time and became very misunderstood, and probably because of a lack of understanding and wisdom, they probably said, take that, put it on the shelf, because most people in a Gentile culture have no concept of that. Christianity has almost no concept of that. Judaism, however, does. But instead of looking at it as a singular man who comes down and we pray to that, it's the idea of, no, Adam represents a body. Okay, our Father in heaven had a body of people. We call them up like a body. And even like Christ says, become part of the body of Christ. Or does he mean literally we're going to become part of his literal body? No. We're going to become part of those who comprise his people, his group of people. And so we all got shattered. And we came down. We fell down. Now we're going to put those particles back together. They're going to become whole and one. And we're going to become a resurrected being. Similar patterns on a micro scale for us, macro scale for humanity, and in that state, all of us, we reach a state of oneness that Christ represented with his state of oneness with the Father. In other words, we all become one, a state of at one, echad, unity, unified. And unfortunately, there's really no word in our culture that gives it any real full definition. We say one, we say echad, we say united, but it's something more than that. And to understand it means we can only experience that. And we experience that at the point at the top of there right before called da'at, where is knowledge. That's experiencing. That's where that is experienced. So we're starting from the bottom of the tree, and we're following paths or pathways back up the tree. There are several paths, but the path that we want is the way. We want the center path, the center pillar, the way of balance, the way of the Messiah. That's what we're seeking.
Do you think the word communion is approaching that?
I think, yeah, like even our sacrament or communion, it approaches that concept. It's almost like we don't have enough, our language is just insufficient to fully be able to describe. We get portions of it, but I think the only people that ever could fully give you an understanding of it are the people who've been through it themselves, who've reached that state. And when they share that, like Christ does his oneness with the Father with us, then rather than being able to explain it, you experience it. Because, like it says in the Scriptures, sometimes there are just things that are great and marvelous, unlawful to be uttered, not because it's illegal and you're going to be arrested if you say it. It's because you can't say it. There's no power in our language. It just doesn't have. Human language does not have the capacity to describe what they're trying to convey.
I'm just seeing like the ancient tabernacle in our temple ceremony as a total overlay of this, as our bodies, as well as the walking temples that this is to teach.
Exactly, which brings me to my next slide. So, in Mormonism, we often talk about celestial, terrestrial, telestial, and outer darkness. Section 76 overlays over this section very carefully. And if you think about it, in the Hebrew, we have absolute, which is what we equate to our celestial world. Bria is our Edenic world, the world of creation. Then we have Yetzirah, a world of formation where things begin to form together and manifest. Then we have Asya, which is like this world. So 4 worlds of ascent, and we would think of it in terms of celestial, terrestrial, telestial, outer darkness. We're ascending. So which kind of, in one way, is kind of sucks, because if you think about it, where would that really put us?
Well, that's kind of Babylon state, so kind of
Dark down here. and yet the funny thing about it is, in this world, we are, conceptually, in ancient Israel, this would be considered like the negative of a real picture. In other words, imagine taking a photograph and seeing the negative and thinking that you have the real picture, but you only have the negative. And if you never saw the real picture, how would you know that this negative wasn't real? But then if you see the real picture, you're going, oh, whoa, this whole thing opens up. And that's the whole idea behind how we approach the Scriptures. We're starting out in that negative, two-dimensional, black and white kind of approach. But what we want to understand is it's like approaching a work of art. It's going to have pixels. It's going to have depth. We want to approach it from different vantage points. In other words, if I approach the Book of Mormon from an idea of a prophetic present, then I'm going to read the story of Nephi, and I'm going to read all these stories as if that's the present story that I have. If I look at it from a prophetic past, then I'm going to say, okay, how does Nephi's story relate to the ancient world that was more ancient than himself? And if I look at a prophetic future, how does this relate to the full circle cycle of starting at the ancient, falling down to where we're at, and returning back to the ancient order of things, which is Edenic state, celestial state, complete eternal round, a complete cycle. And so everything in Hebrew is cyclical. So whether it be prophecy, whether it be events, whether it be our progression, we go through cycles. We even go through cycles in our own life. It says sometimes we go through a cycle every 7 years. And so we follow those same cyclical patterns. But the idea is, when we look at these diagrams, everything is meant to be taken in a conceptual level. So try not to look at it as, concrete. Okay, this one is this one, this is this one. It's the idea of a concept you're meant to understand as part of eternal progression. Which is interesting enough, because if you were to, while we have a two-dimensional image on one side, the actual tree is a sphere. And it's very similar to the idea of the Liahona in the Book of Mormon. The Liahona, notice that it had two spindles. You have two pillars on the tree of life. Okay, it pointed the direction which way you're to go in the wilderness. And writing would appear on it from time to time, giving them instructions on how to travel. Same thing with the tree of life. There are paths, okay, with Hebrew letters that represent a certain path between one place or another, or one condition or emanation to another. And it represents that same journey. So in the Liahona, we have a 3D representation of someone carrying a physical tree of life instrument that was probably a temple instrument. It was probably something that was actually crafted for the temple, and brought it out, gave them directions, following the same pattern. The Hebrew language follows the same archetypal structure. You have 3 mother letters, okay? God would be like, imagine God. And I know this sounds funny. This is where the polygamy thing's in, so don't freak out. But this is where the polygamy aspect does come into it. Conceptually, not in real life. Okay. But the idea being God, okay, Abraham, 3 mother letters, Sarah, Keturah, and what's the third one now? Oh my gosh. Sarah and Hagar. Sorry. Hagar. So the idea, you'll see those similar patterns throughout Scripture, but in the archetypal Hebrew universe, you have 3 mother letters: Shem, Shin, Mem, and Aleph. And then, of course, you have 7 double letters. They have a representation, several things: the 7 wives, the 7 women, the 7 prophetesses. Like, for example, if anybody quotes to you Isaiah 4:1, "In that day, 7 women will take hold of one man." Okay, if they're telling you that's about polygamy, it's not. It's the 7 women, the Pleiades is what it represents, and also the 7 connecting rungs of Jacob's ladder, connecting into who was that one man. Well, the next verse in its parallelism reveals that. Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, God, Jehovah. He's the one man those 7 women connect to. And then they bring forth a beautiful branch. So when you look at these things, it's not, people are applying these things in an ultra-literal interpretation. And rather than trying to understand that this is like, for example, one of the aspects of the book of Isaiah being an instruction manual on how a person is meant to progress up the tree of life, okay, they see it as, oh no, see, this is a prophetic thing. So one of these days, there's going to come a point where 7 women all are going to take hold of one man, and that's really going to happen. And I'm going, well, I guess it's possible. I don't buy it. In all thousands of years that it happened, it didn't even happen in the days of Israel, because we understood that it was they'll say, well, the destruction of Israel and the northern kingdom, that happened. And I go, no, we have no records of that. We have no record that ever occurred. The idea is conceptual. We're taking metaphorical language, symbolic language, and we're interpreting it hyperliteral. Well, what we need to do is to unlock it. And we need to understand, wait a minute, that book of Isaiah was really not written in chapters and verses. It was written as an entire text. So in this case, what the book of Isaiah would do in Isaiah 4 is giving you the idea of a concept, that there was a concept in ancient Israel that is symbolized by the 7 stars of the Pleiades, called the 7 sisters, the 7 wives, the 7 prophetesses. And what's interesting is if you go and look at the 7 women, the dominant 7 women in the Tanakh, each of them represent one of those stars, and the women are meant to have learned a lesson about divine feminine from those women. So it would be Eve is your first one. It would be, I always have to get these right, Eve, Sarah, Hagar. I always have to count these, and then I think it's the big ones: Sarah, Hagar, Rachel, and Leah. But then again, you can do it again as you get into the prophets. They'll begin to give you. You'll see these 7 women. How do you know that's the case? Well, you'll see the symbolism replicated over and over in the scriptures. So, for example, if you were to look at the Book of Mormon, do you know there were 7 churches in the land of Zarahemla? 7 churches. There were 7 churches in the Book of Mormon. These 7 churches have a relationship to those 7 women, who have a relationship to the 7 women of Isaiah, who have a relationship to the 7 matriarchs of Israel. And there's different ones. Sometimes people they'll put in Deborah. Sometimes they'll put in, I've seen people put in Esther. But I tend to go with the more ancient feminine, which is your matriarchs that are mentioned in the Torah. And I think each of them are meant to give you a lesson in the divine feminine, Eve being the very first one.
So who are the other 2?
Okay, so I'll give you a list of what I've seen so far. Okay, so we've got Eve, Sarah, Hagar. Then we've got Rachel and Leah. And then I've seen one is Noah's wife.
Nama.
Yeah, one is Noah's wife. I've seen, but understand, I've seen varying ones. So, like for example, some don't start with Eve. Some start with Sarah. They'll go Sarah, Hagar, Keturah, Rachel, Leah. All the wives of Jacob. They go different ones. So the idea is when you see, but here's really the base idea that'll help you. When you see a feminine woman's name mentioned in Scripture, there's something about that name. And there's something about that woman and in that story that is meant to teach you a lesson about the divine feminine. Even there's a negative aspect of the divine feminine, which is why certain feminine words or women are often portrayed sometimes in the negative. When you see that negative story, it's meant to teach you something that this is the feminine out of balance. So you see, it's the context of the story. Like, for example, what was the name of the woman in that? Tamar. There's also one in the Book of Mormon I'm thinking of. She was the one that they went. One of the sons of Alma went after.
Oh, Jezebel?
Was it Jezebel in the Book of Mormon too?
Yeah.
Okay.
Jezebel.
Yes. So
Orientum.
yes, the son went after her.
Isabel.
Yeah, Isabel.
Jezebel.
That's it. Yeah. So for example, if you examine more closely, first the meaning of her name. Okay, but notice it talks about that she was a harlot, which means that she's playing the whore. Now, there's something about that name and there's something about that story involving that son that is meant to give you an understanding of what happens when someone falls away from the correct understanding of the divine feminine. And if you think about it, wasn't the son going after an aberration? He wasn't going after to marry her. She was a harlot. So she's described in a certain way. So when you see feminine elements, you're beginning to see teachings regarding the radiance of the tree of life, what is behind the veil, what is a portrayal in the positive. If you have a virgin that is faithful aspect, Mary, Miriam, Mary Magdalene, all examples of the positive aspect of the divine feminine. But what do you do with the great whore of all the earth? There's something related there that is the negative aspect of the divine feminine. And all it depends on what you're looking at and your approach. So when you approach the scriptures, be open to looking and exploring those names and those situations. So again, here is what we call, I call it Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, man, but it's basically the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. And if you look at it, notice if you read it from top to bottom, what does it look like? The Yud is the head, the Hey is your arms and shoulders, yeah. The Vav is your torso, and the lower Hey is your legs. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
I've looked at that, and a lot of times the yod is like the fingerprint of God, right? They say the touch. Hey, a lot of times to me looks like the tense or the feminine. Va, hey. I think it's masculine, feminine, feminine,
It could easily be.
which makes the name of God. 'Cause
Yeah.
it's both.
It's both. It's both masculine and feminine. And what the interesting thing about it is that in the Book of Mormon, and we're going to talk about this a little later, is the symbolism behind this, as well as the Lord touching the 16 stones of the brother of Jared, and how that relates to ascending the tree.
Would hey or ha? Because sometimes I think of the breath of life, the ha,
It's the breath of life.
also has a lot, like you were saying, the rach
The Ruach Elohim is feminine in its
is the feminine,
functionality.
it's the breath.
Breathes
And in
life.
the ancient, she would hold the, what is the one that's the, it goes up the circle.
Oh, the Ankh?
The ankh, which is like the breath of life to the nose,
Oh,
to
interesting.
give the breath.
There you go. So you
That's why
see.
I'm like yod, he, va, he.
Yeah.
It has the breath.
And I'll play for you a little later an intonation, which is part of, we're going to talk about literally calling upon the name of the Lord. We're going to teach you how, according to the Book of Mormon.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Thank you.
So here's where we have to start. Now, remember that. Okay, remember that diagram. You're starting at the bottom. Now we want to ascend to the top. We can talk all day about, you can have endless discourses on the structure of the tree of life, its meanings, and we still wouldn't begin to scratch the surface. But for us in our practical world, we have to be able to ascend that tree, which means we can't do it alone and we need help. Well, the Book of Mormon, as a sealed book or a symbolic or encrypted book, gives us that knowledge. It actually teaches us how to do what the ancients did. And we're going to discuss two of those tools today because we just don't have the time to get to the last three. But we'll have to come back and do those last three sometime. But today the first two are the first one is the most important one because of the foundation upon which all the others are built. Okay, so first thing we understand is that the Book of Helaman is where we're going to start. The Book of Helaman is probably one of the most neglected books in the Book of Mormon. While on the Peshat, or literal level, we are given a story that appears to be the account of the social and political struggles between the Nephites and the Gadianton robbers, the book is actually encoded with ancient prophetic teachings of ancient Israel. It is these teachings which hold the keys to entering in by the gate, becoming sanctified, speaking the tongues of angels, and the secret of Messiah. Very important book and very symbolic. The problem is we read the literal language never knowing the symbolic is just waiting right under the veil, waiting for us. But how do we unlock it? Well, even though we put things in chapters and verses, the Hebrew doesn't quite do that. One will lead into the other, one is connected. You're going to find that the scriptures are uniquely intertwined. Okay? So to uncover the mystery of Helaman, we have to uncover the mystery of the last chapter of Alma, where he talks about this mystery man called, who we call Hagoth, or in Hebrew, Hagoth. Okay? Which is interesting that it really isn't so much of a name as it is descriptive. And it came to pass that Hagoth, he being an exceedingly curious man, when you see that phrase in the scriptures, mark this in your notes, wherever you see it, curious man, curious workmanship, you are at a very ancient teaching. Okay? Therefore he went forth and built himself an exceedingly large ship. Wait a minute, vessel time. Merkavah, Ma'aseh Merkavah, we're going to explore this a little more. This is the working of a vessel. On the borders of the land, bountiful. Do you know that even the land names of the Book of Mormon and the seas, the east, north, south, and west, all are representative of what we call a divine cosmic cube of the ancient Israel, of how they literally personified their universe. The names, the land of desolation and those kind of things, all ancient names, patterned after things in the old world that they brought over here, that they've named probably here, and they also are meant to teach us about a journey. Anyway, and they launched it forth into the West Sea. Very important, West Sea. If we're going into the Sea West, that's the point of all journeys of ascent start into the West. They start in the West. Go from the West to the East, the point of greatest light. By the narrow neck, which was in the land northward, Alma 63:5. Now, there has been much speculation about the man Hagoth, who built the ships and who set sail with many people into the land northward. Some say he is the father of the Polynesians, while others suggest he and his people were the ancestors of varying other nations. Whatever the genealogical implications may be, there is a much more ancient and hidden teaching associated with this exceedingly curious man. And the setting of the story of Hagoth actually commences in the preceding verse. And it came to pass in the 37th year of the reign of the judges, there was a large company of men, even to the amount of 5,400 men. By the way, when the Book of Mormon, I won't go into it today, when the Book of Mormon mentions numbers, probably a good idea to pay attention to those numbers and their symbolic meanings. They will yield more of the story. And with their wives and their children, and they departed out of the land of Zarahemla, which was north, and into the land which was northward. Anytime you see the land northward or north, that is the place in the north is the place of power. It's often referred to as a place of darkness, but not evil darkness. It's the place where we cannot see. So all light and truth commences in the south and the southeast, but that's where we're taught, and then we go into the north because then we're able to go through the darkness to that which is greater. Yes.
The land north with the Native Americans also means connection with your ancestors, and the other side, and kind of a veil going.
Yeah, it's also, even the things that we'll go into, some of the names in these things will show you, different the symbols, the multidimensional symbols that you'll see encrypted into the text. So in the Israelite prophetic tradition, like we said, people are going to go to the land north, in which corresponds to strength and power, the abode of the powers and principalities of the world of the angelic. While the literal story portrays a group of people who built ships to sail to the land northward, the underlying prophetic story is about a group of people who transcended the natural man and woman and ascended into the upper worlds. The phrase curious man, as I said, is an Israelite prophetic marker that connects the man Hagoth to Moses' tabernacle in the wilderness, specifically the ephod of the high priest. Exodus 28:8. And the curious girdle of the ephod, which is upon it, shall be the same, according to the work thereof, even of gold and of blue and of purple and scarlet. When you see colors in the scriptures, those colors have meanings. They have names. They're mints. They're telling you more than just scarlet. Scarlet has a very symbolic meaning. Green has a very symbolic meaning. Each of these colors play intricate, add intricate details. So colors mean things, numbers mean things. Little phrases that you may read right over will yield more to you. I was reading one the other day I'd been looking over, and I've been reading over for a number of times. And I finally looked at it and go, oh my gosh, I can't believe I missed that. It's like here he is doing a parallelism, and the words that he's using would be, as I put them back into Hebrew, it's like, here's Ammon talking about how he led the people back to ascend to the land of Zarahemla, but yet the story is about teaching a people how to take the secret path back to the land of Zarahemla. Interesting. In other words, the use of description, curious man, is a marker that we're about to explore some very ancient teachings. The next word of importance is the meaning of the name Hagoth. It, besides carrying a relationship to the word Haggai, meaning festive or ingathering of people, which is also descriptive, and if you think about it, a Hag Hamotzi, those kind of things, it's an ingathering. What did he do? He gathered a group of about 5,000 people, and he took them to the land north. But it's more important than that. So it is connected to the idea of a gathering of people, but it actually is the word for Hagoth, meditations. Okay? My mouth shall speak of wisdom, and the meditation, Hagoth, of my heart shall be of understanding. Here the word for meditation is the Hebrew word Hagoth, and it comes from the root word Haggah, meaning to growl, meditate, or the growling of a lion. And if you remember last time, I talked a little bit about the roaring of the lions. That's when Enoch was with his people, and the giants of the land were coming up against them, and they heard the roaring of the lions out of the wilderness. This is the roaring of the lions. This is the foundation of that teaching, is that the idea of prophetic speech. And prophetic speech isn't for telling the future. Prophetic speech is a language of power that we do not have, and is kept from the natural man for reasons very wise to God. Because if we had that speech, God help us what we do to each other. We can see with the weapons what we do to each other now. Imagine what if we had that type of godly power. We would destroy everything, and the natural man would destroy it all. But here, the idea, the usage of the word would draw the Israelite reader that the ancient teachings are, regarding the roaring of the lion, these things are about meditation. Now, our modern word meditation does not quite grasp the Hebrew concept of meditation. It's what we use. But Hagoth, okay, it's the idea of a murmuring or a sound, so that we get the idea of some type of sound and vibration used to reach a state of consciousness or spiritual connection. But the actual better understanding in Hebrew of meditation is not meditating on something to reach nirvana or nothingness. It's bonding with God. I'm meditating to become one with God. I'm meditating on Him and the state of oneness, not ethereal nothingness. That's the idea. Yeah.
And a lot of the ancients, they don't use the vowels in the words, like they put the consonants.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meditation, they will use the om.
Exactly.
Because it has this vibration to it
Mm-hmm.
that they use for connection.
Now think about this. Om, two of the mother letters, which are the physical two of the mother letters that make the physical pronunciation of the name of God. We have three mother letters, but two of them, and how it was pronounced verbally anciently, was not Om, but Aleph Mem Shin, Om Sh, or how we do it, Shema. Shema Yisrael, Shema. It's the verbal, physical manifestation of the name of God.
So when they're talking about Solomon and his hymns,
Yeah.
there's a lot in the playing the instruments, but it's this vibration that seems to connect
Yeah.
the other world with this world, or beginning the process.
It opens the door.
Opening the door.
Yeah. And I'm going to let you hear one today, which by a friend of mine has done an amazing work on this. And you can actually get it from his website, but I'll play his interesting on calling upon the name. You will hear it as closest to the ancient pronunciation, not the consonantal pronunciation, but the vowel pronunciation of the name, and which is a priestly pronunciation of the name of God, and how they used it. It has a very unique vibration. Meditate to it. I do, and I will have to tell you, it's very sobering and very comforting for me. That's all I can say.
Does he go through the 72 names of God?
Not on this one.
Okay.
Not on this one. This is just calling upon the name. Okay.
Can I make one other mention? Just we had a dear friend pass, and I don't know if I can even say it, but Lori, Gamble. Anyway, and I just felt like it was on the full moon. The moon was in front. I didn't know it when I went up to the top of the mountain to a Virgo, and somebody had sent me just kind of a meditative, but it's a calling is to awaken, and it was Ka'al. Anyway, and you'd sing it, and then at the end it says, from thee I come, to thee I go.
Well, interesting.
And it's just a song. And it was so beautiful and so powerful, but it was I felt like it was like a morning crying out, but also a celebration. And it was really beautiful. And I thought, our hymns are pretty staid, kind of, but it is powerful. Sound is powerful.
And remember, in the beginning, so according to Israelite tradition, the creation was sung into existence. So the power of sound and vibration, who knows?
Yeah.
Thank
You.
And again, I don't want to belabor this point because this is on the full presentations on my thing, but I want us to get into this just to lay a foundation that the backdrop behind Helaman is the idea of that Helaman itself contains those meditations that we're given by them to help us to ascend to the land northward. Now you probably say, how do you know this? Well, here's the interesting part of Alma 63:11 through 13 that gives you the key. Here we go. Yeah, that's right. 63:11 to 13. Therefore it became expedient, this is after he's talked about Hagoth, for Shiblon to confer those sacred things before his death upon his son Helaman. So Helaman's getting something sacred. Who was called Helaman, being after the name of his father. Now behold, all those engravings. When you see the phrase engravings, is a symbolic meaning for meditations.
Wow.
Okay? because the idea of meditation is you are engraving something on your spirit, your mind, and your heart. It's the idea of engraving. So it's about, there was a literal engraving on the plates. There is an engraving. The idea of engraving is an act or discipline of meditation. Yes, ma'am.
One more that's just fascinating. So in the pyramid text, which is literally down in the tomb and the most ancient text we have, they have the engravings of the hymns
Oh,
that would be sung by the deceased
as they
ascend. And that's the one I think I've showed where in the daylight you can just see the engravings and his sarcophagus, but if you turn off the light and then flash the flashlight along the wall, you see a relief carving of the pharaoh's body reaching up and going through the wall,
Oh, wow. There
the
you go.
alabaster wall.
That's amazing.
So he would sing the engravings to transport.
Wow, that's amazing.
That's
We'll see that
amazing.
sometime.
They
Yeah.
understand that to even create that.
I know. Well, they understood it to create that,
That's
right?
amazing.
So it's truths that are coming from God being
Yeah.
illustrated, but this was down in a coffin, right? Nobody's going to really ever see that. It's buried and sealed.
But they went to
He
great
would,
strings to put it
because
there.
they know your spirit is eternal. It's so
Yeah.
different. Like it was a factual thing that would happen. Yeah.
So you think about this. So now we're being given, just like you're talking about, now we're getting ready to be given the actual meditations, instructions, and discipline that they had. And they're passing on to us to do what? To bond with God, to ascend, to be one with Him. Okay? So, in other words, and in the Israelite prophetic tradition, the concept of engravings carries with deeper meaning than just carving out letters on a plate. It is connected with meditation or engraving on our minds and hearts. Specifically, the word hachach, meaning to cut or engrave. The word hach representing an insertion of the spiritual into the physical. It also carries connections with progression from the physical to the spiritual, from being unclean to becoming pure. So in other words, if I were to insert the word meditations in for engravings, we might read something like this. Therefore, it became expedient for Shimlon to confer those sacred things before his death upon the son of Helaman, who was called Helaman, which was called after the name of his father. And now behold, all those meditations which were in the possession of Helaman, which were written and sent forth among the children of men throughout all the land, except it were those parts which had been commanded by Alma should not go forth. Nevertheless, these things were to be kept sacred and handed down from one generation to another. Therefore, in this year they had been conferred upon Helaman before the death of Shimlon. So, in other words, Helaman was giving these sacred meditations. And then what do you have next? The Book of Helaman. But then we read it and you're going, this is a story about, wars and people getting killed and somebody, people, getting set on fire and that kind of thing and the Gadianton robbers. Well, yeah, that's the literal story. So now we're going to explore the figurative story. But remember this. In the Israelite mind, meditation is the idea of bonding or becoming one with God. In all meditation and all bonding, just remember, the whole goal is not to reach a state of nothingness. It's to reach a state of oneness. That's the goal. In everything we do is to be a state of oneness, a state of balance with God.
Do you think there's something with that hakah, to cut, and then also to cut a covenant?
You think?
Okay, can you explain that a little more, or that is the whole point?
That is the purpose of the covenant.
And that spiritual and physical to spiritual bonding
Yes.
is the covenant.
Now I have to get this the right one here. Hang on just
Wow.
one moment. I need to go back one. Let's see.
So
You're just a treasure box. You're so fun.
Great.
So Robin,
I love it.
even in marriage, the woman is cut when they have
Mm-hmm.
intercourse for the first time. There's blood.
To cut the
Introduction.
covenant. Wow.
How do you find how do you find the names of God? How do you find the meditations in the Book of Helaman? Okay. When you read the very first part of Helaman, it talks about there was a chief judge who died, and he left his sons. Peharan was the chief judge, and he had 3 sons. Peharan, Pekumani, and Pe Anki. Those are not their names. This is this is a figurative story. Okay, Pe Horan, Pe, the voice from the mountain. Pe Anki, the voice of darkness. Pe Kumani, the voice of power. Now that's in the first chapter. Go to chapter 12, which is technically the real end of Helaman. And God speaks with a voice from the mountain, and the mountains shake, the voice of power, and the voice of cursing or darkness. The three voices of God. Or we might even say it this way. There are three sources by which a man receives revelation. God himself and the adversary is one of its potential interpretations. But either way, what we want to look at, there's a chapter, and I thought I already had it out, which drives me nuts when I do this. Give me just a moment here.
So Pe Horan.
I'm going to try to find it. Pe Horan.
Oh, that's a mountain?
What's Pe Horan? Haran, mountain?
Okay.
Yeah.
And Anki is darkness, and Kumani, where'd you get that one?
To represent the voice on the tree again.
The voice of darkness.
They're the sons of Pehoran in first chapter.
So those three voices are like within us too. We have the voice of God, the
Yeah.
voice of
It
ourselves,
also-
the voice of darkness.
So which
Exactly.
one is ourselves, the mountain?
Well, they're all three of us. All three of
When you
us.
say the voice of God,
Oh,
the voice
pe-
of
oh,
evil, and
pe-
the voice of ourselves. Which
Yeah.
one is ourselves out of
Oh,
the,
Pekumani.
the
Pekumani. Yeah, the voice of power.